I'm first going to say a few words about the United States Studies Center for those who may want to know a little bit more about it, and then get specifically into a few points about our postgraduate program. But we'll turn quickly over to the night's activities. The U.S. Studies Center is now 6 years old and was founded on the back of a grant from the Australian government and a collection of persons who thought it was important that Australia have a dedicated center for the study of the United States, with the aim of improving awareness, understanding, and appreciation of the United States and of the importance of the U.S.-Australia relationship. It's our ambition not only to meet those requirements, but also to become the leading center for the study of the United States outside of the United States. And I can say that we've made great strides in that direction. We have three core areas of activity. Perhaps most important to most folks in this room, we are today teaching over 1,300 students who passed through our courses at both the undergraduate and graduate level. We offer, as the video has just suggested, excellent opportunities for our students to take part in study and intern abroad, opportunities in the United States. We also have a very active public outreach and media program, very much like our event this evening, where we're able to convene groups of persons, interested observers, leading experts, who are able to inform the broader interested public about developments in relation to the United States, cutting across a range of issues from culture to music to foreign policy to politics and economics and beyond. Lastly, we also engage in what we like to call our think tank projects, where we reach out to supporters in the private sector, corporate, foundation, but also to other governments for support to conduct studies across, again, a range of issues, which importantly bring Americans and Australians together to look at common problems and to seek common solutions. And throughout all of these activities, we're very, very proud that we've been able here in Sydney to attract some of the very best minds from the United States, from Australia, as well as from around the Asia Pacific to come and engage with our students in opportunities that we think are rather rare for any student experience in Australia today. Let me talk a little bit more about the postgraduate program we have here. As we hope the video is able to suggest, we offer an exciting range of postgraduate study options. As noted there, our flagship program is the Masters of U.S. Studies, which is the only degree of its kind in Australia. We believe it provides a deep knowledge and understanding about U.S. politics, U.S. history, U.S. culture, and understanding about America's influence in the world. And we believe it provides an excellent grounding for a range of professional opportunities following graduation. We would also allow students to extend their knowledge, to do an extra semester of research exchange or an internship as part of their master's degree program. Other programs offered are the graduate diploma and certificate, which require a shorter commitment of only 2 semesters full-time. Individual units of study can also be taken as part of other degrees at the University of Sydney or simply for your own interest through non-award study. We believe that the postgraduate U.S. Studies program is more than just a degree. Students have access, as we've said, to the center's high-profile network of scholars, government and business leaders coming from Australia, coming from the United States, as well as from around the region. And our students are invited to take part in these activities, meet with these individuals, to engage with them closely. So that leads me to tonight's event, which we think is another standout example of the kinds of opportunities we can offer. We have an outstanding panel that's going to share with you their insights around the topic of what's next for the United States in Syria. And it's my great pleasure then to introduce the moderator of that panel, John Barron. John is known to, I'm sure, to many of us here in Australia as one of the finest journalists at the ABC and co-host of the television show Planet America. We're very also happy to say that John teaches a postgraduate course with us here on U.S. media at the Center for the U.S. Studies Center, and is as well a research associate with us. So, without further ado, let me turn the floor over to John Barron. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Bates. I mean, I'd like to start with, I guess three weeks ago, we were also thinking, is America about to invade Syria? Or at least, some sort of a targeted military strike against the Assad regime's alleged chemical weapons infrastructure. Now, of course, 3 weeks later, we're wondering whether the Grand Canyon's going to reopen anytime soon. As we've been sort of having our eye taken somewhat off the ball by the colour and movement of a budget impasse and a shutdown, what's been happening in Syria since that moment about 3 weeks ago?
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very grateful for being invited to this gathering. Look, I think the killing fields are continuing in Syria. Perhaps the most important development has been that the United States and Russia have reached an agreement to disarm Syria of its weapons of mass destruction, and more specifically chemical weapons. I suppose that is a very positive development, but I doubt very seriously that that's going to make any difference on the ground. As far as the conflict is concerned, and as long as the suffering of the Syrian people is concerned, I mean, that's really going to continue. I don't see an end in sight to this conflict for some time to come. And I think Syria has proved to be a very difficult target for the United States. It's a very complex situation, and that complexity is really at three levels. I mean, the first one is at the national level, where you really have serious ethnic, sectarian, ideological conflicts, and of course the population of the country, or Syria, is socially very, very divided altogether. And then you've got the complexities at the regional level, where you really have a serious proxy conflict going on between Iran and its supporters in the region, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, and you have Saudi Arabia and its Arab supporters, and these two regional players are backing different horses in Syria, in the Syrian conflict. And then you have, of course, the complexities also at the international level, and that is that the differences between Russia and China on one side and the United States on the other. And of course, Syria in many ways has become a sort of excuse in the differences which really emerged between the United States and Russia, and to some extent China. And that's largely because that I think the Russians would like to really not only make a sort of a comeback on the world stage and to try to show their diplomatic muscle, and if possible also some degree of geopolitical gains in the Middle East, but I think it's also simply because that the United States is in many ways a fairly declining power in the Middle East. Its influence is really diminishing.
We'll talk some more about lots of issues there to touch on in a moment. But first, Tom Switzer, can I get a sense from you? There was this perception that last month the United States may have been within 24 hours of launching airstrikes. And then we saw what appeared to the outsiders to be almost an example of gaffe diplomacy from Secretary of State John Kerry. What was your take on that, and also the events leading up to that, which seemed to be, on the one hand, President Obama looking to build an international coalition, but also trying to build some sort of political consensus at home, and not really seeming to succeed at either?
Well, that's right, John, and I agree with Amin. I think that the vacillation and ineptitude of the administration, and you have to go back during the course of the last 2.5 years, pretty much since the Syrian civil war began in March of 2011, to see all the different positions that the President and his advisors have put out. In 2011, he called on a policy of regime change in Damascus, And then, of course, in August of last year, on the eve of the presidential election campaign, he said that any use of chemical or biological weapons would be crossing a red line, which invited the prospect of US military intervention. And then, of course, after that red line was crossed with the use of chemical weapons on August 21, the President then called on the Congress to give him authorisation to use military force. And then, as you say, we had this Moscow proposal and then the subsequent UN Security Council resolution to identify and then eradicate the Assad regime's chemical and biological weapons. And in many respects, that was a victory for international diplomacy, and it certainly has averted yet another Middle Eastern war. I think that although this ineptitude and vacillation on the part of the presidents has really cost America dearly in terms of prestige and credibility, which are very useful supplements to power, I think it shouldn't disguise the fact that a major full-scale US intervention, it was never on the cards. The national interest did not justify it. I don't think the political support for it among Liberals, Conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, that did not exist, and it could not be mobilised. And I think most seasoned observers of this conflict, and it's claimed up to 100,000, some say up to 110,000 people, it is in many respects morally ambiguous. I think a lot of Americans caught on to this. Yes, the Assad regime was a brutal tyranny backed by the Iranian mullahs and Hezbollah. But on the other hand, the rebels were a disparate group. They consisted of a lot of unsavoury, some might say extremist, even Al-Qaeda related groups, as well as the Sunni regimes in the region. So it was a bit morally ambiguous, and I think that's ultimately why the president was, in a weird, sick, twisted way, happy that the Russians gave him the lifeline. And as you say, it all came about in London when the Secretary of State Joe Biden got John Kerry. No, it was the Secretary of State John Kerry who was asked that hypothetical, and he latched onto it, and subsequently the lifeline from the Russians.
Right, Adam Lockyer, can I get your thoughts on the domestic political push from President Obama? Why, when this is a Congress that only a few months ago decided not to take military-style assault weapons out of the hands of people with a history of psychiatric disorders, why he would ask Congress then to turn around and take chemical weapons off Bashar al-Assad?
So this is basically because the British didn't play ball. So his first preference was to build up a broad international coalition amongst his NATO allies and strike alone. So he didn't think he needed to go to Congress originally. Then the British took that resolution under Chapter 7 to the United Nations, but then on the next day, on the Thursday, went to Parliament. Couldn't get through Parliament. So without getting the British on board, he had some French support, but without broad international support, he needed some sort of extra political cover. So he woke up heard about Thursday. On the Friday, he woke up, and I think that he was still expecting to strike back at Syria. He went for a walk in the Rose Garden with Dennis McDonough, his Chief of Staff, and it was Dennis McDonough who discussed the opportunity of going to Congress. And this is a way of spreading the political blame if things do go south. And so they then took this to the National Security Council, and the National Security Council was divided. Some thought that Obama should use executive powers and just still strike back at Syria. Others said, no, this is a good idea of going to Congress. Obama held the line, took it to Congress. Went to the Senate, in the Senate Foreign Relations, and they passed a resolution. They wanted to give the President the authorisation to take punitive action against the Syrian regime. But then when it went to a full congressional discussion, it was clear that they didn't have the numbers. And the Congress said no. But they said no for many of the right reasons. They were asking the right questions. So what happens if they use chemical weapons again? Do we strike again? If we do strike, what is the end game here? I mean, what are we trying to achieve? Are we just trying to punish the Assad regime for using these weapons, or are we trying to disarm Assad? What happens if there is a humanitarian disaster and we need to put to take further action. So they're asking all the right questions. So this was actually Congress doing its job, unlike the government shutdown now when it's not doing its job.
Amin, Saikal, how was that situation in Congress received in the Middle East? They're used to American presidents launching cruise missiles first and asking Congress or anyone else for permission later. Was this shown as a sign of weakness of America in retreat, or Barack Obama being a very different kind of American president?
Well, I think it depends very much, who you really discuss this with. I mean, obviously, it was very disappointing to a number of America's Arab allies. I mean, the Saudis and certainly the Qataris and a number of other Arab countries in the Gulf would have really liked to see the United States launching a military campaign. And of course, Turkey, which is one of the important allies of the United States and a member of NATO, and for that matter, a fairly active member of NATO in the region, I would have liked to really see the United States going in and weaken the position of Assad and enabling the opposition to take over. But of course, there has been a great deal of worry on the part of the Arab countries as well as Turkey about what might really replace the Assad regime. I mean, that's another thing that they've all been really concerned with. And I'm sure it was also incredibly disappointing for Israel, because Israelis would have liked to really see the United States go in. But then on the other hand, I think the general view in the Middle East is that the United States influence has been really in decline for some time in the region. The United States is not as much of a determining actor as it used to be. Its geopolitical assets have been really diminishing, particularly in the light of the Arab uprisings and the way the United States has really conducted themselves in handling those uprisings has been incredibly contradictory. On the one hand, it supported the aspirations of the Egyptian people and the Tunisian people and the Syrian people. And then on the other hand, it remained very much silent on the uprisings in Bahrain, and where the majority of the population, that's the Shiite population, have risen against the Sunni minority Arab ruling family in the country. And it has remained very much muted on the issue of democratization in Saudi Arabia and a number of other GCC, that's the Gulf Cooperation Council countries in the area. So I think overall it's been more viewed as another sign of weakness on the part of the United States, and another signal on the part of the United States that is becoming very war-weary, particularly in the light of the Iraq fiasco and also what is really shaping up as an Afghan debacle.
Tom, can I ask you, back in early September, then opposition leader Tony Abbott was asked for his take on the situation in Syria, and he was pilloried for describing it as not good guys versus bad guys, but bad guys versus bad guys, or baddies versus baddies, I think was the phrase that he used. But to what extent is that actually a telling characterisation, the notion that this is a conflict where it's hard to say who the United States, much less an ally such as Australia, should be backing in all this?
Well, that's exactly right, and I think that's what was on the minds of a lot of American legislators on both sides of the political fence. It gets back to the point I made earlier, a morally ambiguous conflict. I remember 20 years ago, at the height of the Bosnian crisis, people would say it was a morally ambiguous conflict, but I think this is far more morally ambiguous in many respects. And look, if you look at the rebellion or the opposition groups, they are a disparate group. And it is certainly true, as Kevin Rudd tried to say during that stoush with Tony Abbott, that there are certainly elements within the opposition groups, the Free Syrian Army, the National Coalition of Syria, that are generally speaking committed to liberal secular ideals. But over time, during the course of this civil war, the more extremist groups linked to jihadi groups have had a great say, and there is serious tension now between the jihadi groups on the one hand and the more secular moderate groups, so much so that in the makeup of a post-Assad regime, the jihadi groups have made it absolutely clear that Sharia law will be the state of play in the new Syria, whereas, of course, the more moderate, liberal, secular groups take a completely different view. So to the extent that those divisions prevail, and there is some sort of political transition in coming years, then I don't think this crisis will really be resolved, simply because of those divisions in the opposition.
Adam, how do you think the United States is perceiving itself and its place in the world over Syria? For a long time it was cast as the sometimes unwilling global policeman. Now it almost seems like it's one of those cop movies where the partner's about 2 weeks from retirement and it's kind of lethal weapon sort of thing. Is the global cop sort of packing on the pounds and looking forward to retiring to Fort Lauderdale?
Well, in this case, yes. Obama never wanted to get involved in Syria. His red line comments were intentionally framed so that he wouldn't need to get involved. So there was intelligence that Assad's chemical weapons were on the move, and he knew that if the chemical weapons were used, then the United States would need to be the global cop and take action. And so what the red line statement was all about was a deterrence threat. It was, if you use these weapons, we will come in and punish you. Now, the purpose of that threat was so that Assad wouldn't use the chemical weapons and the United States could stay out of the conflict. He never wanted to get involved. Now, unfortunately, those weapons were used, but he then had locked his reputation into those threats so directly that he thought that he needed to take action in order to maintain America's reputation in the world. In the aftermath, he's then been trying to spread the blame around a bit more, saying that it's not just the United States' responsibility to be the global policeman, it's the international community's responsibility to do the policing.
On that, Amin, given that the red line had been drawn, why did Bashar al-Assad then decide, well, you know what, we're going to use these chemical weapons anyway? There's some evidence to suggest that the conventional weapon bombardment that went afterwards was all designed to sort of allow the gas to disperse, and that they would be blowing up dead bodies with conventional explosives. No one would ever know. Was it as simple as that, or was he trying to achieve something else here?
Well, I think it's very clear that Assad has wanted to play for time. And I think in that he's not alone. He does receive very active advice from Tehran. And also he has been in close consultation with Russia. I think Assad believes, and so has his supporters, that time is on their side. And if they could manage to drag on this conflict for some time, the opposition will fall apart. As Tom pointed out, very desperate opposition, made up of desperate groups. And also the international community is likely, and more specifically the United States and its allies, are going to really get tired of this conflict. And in fact, that the United States has not acted, that has been seen as a victory in Tehran and by Hezbollah, and for that matter, the Assad regime. And the fact that President Obama came out very recently and said that, look, the Assad regime has done a good job in terms of giving up its weapons of mass destruction. The Assad regime was very quick to claim credit for that and say, well, you see, even the American president is very much concerned that, or at least is very supportive of the fact that we've done well, and again, time is on our side. We just really need to hold out. It was very clear that the Assad regime could not use its chemical weapons, or for that matter, if it does have biological weapons, and of course there's no evidence of that so far, he was not in a position to make use of that. Okay, he may have used small amounts a couple of times, and he's paying a high price for that. But it's a price worth really paying, because after that he couldn't really use it, and for that matter, matter. What is really gained is the reputation that, yes, he has avoided a war with the United States, and he has got the support of the international community, a wider the support within the international community, and also he has now really brought the international community inside Syria, and that is the weapon inspectors who've gone to really destroy those weapons. These are the weapons that you couldn't use anyway.
Tom, given the role of Tehran in Syria, of course, not coincidental that we had the almost lunch hall summit at the United Nations a couple of weeks ago. We now have a new Iranian president who tweets. Are we seeing a potential moment now in US-Iranian relations, and to what extent is that flowing from the situation in Syria?
Well, it's hard to know to what extent this is linked to Syria. Amin will know more about that than I, but I certainly think there is a thawing in relations between Tehran and Washington. But I think it goes beyond that. The president doesn't use the word containment, but instinctively I think that he subscribes to the old George H.W. Bush view of realism. And that is, in the case of Iraq, for example, in 2003, the threat that Saddam Hussein posed to the West, according to this logic, could have been contained and deterred the way it had been since the previous Gulf War. Sanctions regime, naval blockade, no-fly zone, it kept Saddam in his box. And if Saddam ever used chemical, biological or nuclear weapons, which of course he never had, it would guarantee massive retaliation. That's the big difference between rogue states, if you like, on the one hand, and terrorists on the other. Terrorists can run and hide, but rogue states have a mailing address. And so I think all the available evidence seems to indicate that Obama recognises that when it comes to dealing with Iranians' nuclear weapons, yes, they'll try to reach an agreement, but ultimately the nuclear weapon issue, which, remember, is popular on all schools of thought, virtually, or opposition groups as well within Iran. So I think the president's coming to grips with the reality that any threat that the Iranian regime poses can be contained and deterred. I think that's ultimately where he's coming from, and to the extent that that's his mindset, I think that is ultimately is still very unpopular with some segments of elite opinion in America, whether it's the liberal hawks at the Washington Post, for example, or the neoconservatives at the Wall Street Journal editorial page. They believe that Iran needs to disarm, and that so long as it has the capacity to develop nuclear weapons, it is a dangerous threat to the region. Realists don't downplay that, but they think that containment and deterrence can work, and I think that's essentially how Obama is viewing the regime. And in many respects, you can make the argument a bit like they détente with the Soviet Union. I mean, it took a cold warrior in not only Richard Nixon, but also Ronald Reagan, who recognised that a détente and arms control could be the way forward with the regime in Moscow. I think ultimately that's the position of the Obama administration, and indeed some Republicans like Rand Paul, who believe that negotiation and conciliation can still work out against a regime like Iran.
Adam, to what extent was certainly US public attention focused too much on the issue of the use of chemical weapons, which, while barbaric and grotesque, have maybe claimed 2,000 lives out of a death toll of the last 2.5 years of about 100,000. Once that sort of pressure valve was released by diplomacy, the caravan moved on.
Oh, that's right. So in DC right now, all the political oxygen is being sucked up by the government shutdown and the looming debt ceiling. So it has moved on. The media did focus for a time on Syria because there was this expectation that Obama was going to take action against the regime. After that was released and diplomacy started to kick in, the diplomacy doesn't really make the news. It's slow and it's tedious. And so it's now just focused straight on back onto the government shutdown.
I mean, do you think that, as far as Bashar al-Assad is concerned, he is thinking that he will have a deal, perhaps with the Russians, along the lines of what Gaddafi managed to do for a time, before it kind of went horribly wrong for him, where you give up the WMDs, you are suddenly treated as a member of the international community, and you are able to stay in power? And if that's his objective, is he likely to achieve it, given the other interests at stake in perhaps keeping the Alawite minority in control?
Well, I think as long as he has the support of Iran, Hezbollah, and indeed the diplomatic protection of Russia and China at the United Nations, I think he has persuaded himself, and he has been persuaded, that he will be able to remain in power, and he's going to be a key player in whatever may eventuate in terms of an overall settlement. And I think his supporters will continue to insist that Assad should be part of the solution, and no viable resolution of the conflict could be secured without Assad's participation. But at the same time, the Russians have indicated that it's not really Assad that they are very much concerned about. They are more concerned about what may replace the Assad regime. But that's not a major concern for the Iranians. I mean, as you know, that President Assad essentially represented the Alawite sects in Syria, which forms about 10% of the population, and the other 20% of the population is made up of Druze and Christians and a number of other minorities, and something like 70% of the population is made up of Sunnis. Of course, the Turks are very much interested in see the empowerment of the Sunnis, but that's not something that the Iranians would like to really see, and for that matter, the Russians wouldn't like to really see. The Russians have had historical differences with Turkey, and they don't want to see another Sunni-dominated regime which could possibly ally with the Turkey emerging in Syria. And the Iranians are very determined to maintain what I call a Shiite strategic entity which has emerged, stretching from Kabul to southern Lebanon. I mean, you have got something like 20% of the Afghan population made up of Shiites, and there's quite a good number of these Shiites that are very close to Iranians and very closely allied with the Iranians. And Western Afghanistan is very much closely linked to Iran. And then you've got, of course, the pro-Iranian groups like Muqtada al-Sadr and so on in Iraq, which basically acting as the mouthpiece and, for that matter, the agent of the Iranians in Iraq. And today it is Iran that's really calls the shots in Baghdad, and not necessarily the United States, despite the fact that the United States lost 4,000 troops and that hundreds, many more thousands were injured, and they fought a trillion war in Iraq. It was really basically to open the way for the Iranian influence to grow in Iraq. And of course, the Assad regime, which has got a strategic partnership with Tehran, is a very critical link to this Shiite entity that I mentioned. And of course, at the other end of the entity, you've got the Hezbollah in Lebanon. And Iran has made this gain not because of any major action on its part, but largely because of the way I see it, American policy failures in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and Lebanon, and on the Israeli-Palestinian front. It has just simply created a vacuum which Iran has skillfully been able to fill.
You mentioned there, I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian question. Tom, a question for you on that. I suppose every second-term American president concentrates on, it seems, two things. One, shilling for donations for the presidential library. Two, peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. They always have a shot at it at some point. It looked as though that window might have been opening earlier this year. John Kerry seemed to be walking towards a door, if not through it. Where do you see that, and how has the situation in Syria been telling in what progress we might see there in the next 3 years?
Well, I've been struck that 2 years ago, we had the President of the United States visit Canberra and Darwin, championing his pivot of US forces to Asia. And yet, a strong argument could be made, particularly in light of his recent absence from a couple of high-profile Asia-Pacific summits, that the pivot hasn't really come about as many suspected it would. There's been reports in various papers about the lack of diplomatic resources from the Americans' part in the region. And of course there have been significant defence cuts in the United States over the last year as part of the sequester. And so, yet last year during the presidential debate on foreign policy, virtually all of the questions that Bob Schieffer from CBS asked the two candidates, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, were about the Middle East and terrorism. Nothing about East Asia or Europe or Latin America. So there is this obsession still with the Middle East, even though Hillary Clinton spent more priorities as Secretary of State in the East Asia region, and you're quite right, John Kerry spent far more time in the Middle East compared to East Asia. What does all this mean? Well, I think certainly if you look at the President's speech to the United Nations last month, he emphasised two key issues for his second term, Iran and the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Amin will know far more about that. I tend to be pessimistic on these issues simply because of the weight of history, notwithstanding some breakthroughs like Camp David in the late 1970s, and of course the Accords reached at Oslo in '93. I want to just take a back step a minute and just get back to a question you asked Adam about the United States. I was speaking this morning at a group at ANU, a bunch of public servants, and I made the point that neither the Australian political elite nor the Australian public has caught on to this point about the extent to which I think America, its credibility and prestige really have been diminished dramatically during the course of the last 10 years. If you look at US popularity rating today in a lot of key Middle Eastern countries, most notably Egypt, Pakistan, and other countries in the region, the approval rating of the United States is today lower than it was in 2007 and 2008. This was during the Bush era. And I think, a great power like the United States can cope with being loathed by certain parts of the world. But what's far more significant is the dissipating of credibility and prestige, particularly in this part of the world. And I think, consequently, a failure to lead and persuade and influence. And I say this with great sorrow because I'm a great fan of the United States and I work at the US Studies Centre, but I think what you're seeing here is not just a president who recognises the costs and the limits of the use of force, and indeed in many respects he's tried to redefine the US role in the world in a way that reflects America's changing circumstances and more limited resources. But I think there's a great sense of foreign policy fatigue in the United States. I don't think this point really gets highlighted much in Australia. I think if you look at all the available public polling evidence among Liberals, Conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, they're tired of the world. And I think in many respects we saw this during last year's presidential campaign. Foreign policy was the dog that did not bark. And I think to the extent that those views and attitudes prevail, you're seeing more of this switch towards caution and modesty in the world, but it's away from, if you like, the hubris, the sweeping proclamations after 9/11, when understandable American outrage over the terrorist attacks, taken together with mental habits of American global hegemony and American exceptionalism, that gave American leaders a real sense of purpose and mission. Those days are clearly over.
Do you share that assessment, Adam, or do you subscribe to the view that for every Jimmy Carter there's a Ronald Reagan around the corner?
Well, foreign policy never really takes a big role in American presidential campaigns. It's all about the domestic issues. There has been exceptions, but normally it's about domestic issues. America's standing in the world on the key issues. So with the government shutdown, the State Department has been quarantined from the government shutdown. The Defence Department, the armed forces have largely been quarantined, whereas on the civilian side there have been some furloughs on that side. But American power, even with the government shutdown, hasn't really taken a hit. But it's the perceptions of American power and leadership in the world. So Obama was missed from APEC, he was missed from the East Asian Summit, and it was because he was distracted by these ongoing battles in Congress. He couldn't get up and leave DC at that time. It would have been a gaffe on the side, on the scale of Hurricane Katrina, that he's distant, that he's not engaged. He had to stay in DC. And the world understood that, but they were disappointed that the United States wasn't there, and other leaders then filled the void. China, Japan, and Russia stepped into that gap that without Obama being there.
In a moment we'll have time to take some questions from you as well, but before we do, and we'll get the roving mic ready for that. I mean, a final question I'd like to ask you about the way the domestic plays into foreign policy. The United States, which for so long was held up as a beacon of democracy, certainly that the Americans felt the Middle East could learn from. Of course, people in the Middle East can watch Al Jazeera too and see the reports coming out of Washington DC and say, what kind of beacon is that? Is damage to America's international prestige being done by the domestic dysfunction on Capitol Hill?
Well, I think that is precisely the point, and if you really look at it, at least in relation to the Middle East, I think most of the people who used to look to the United States as a source of inspiration for democratic reforms in their societies, they are no longer really looking to the United States for, in that sense. I think the American stance in relation to the reversal of some of the important democratic reforms which unfolded in Egypt after the fall of Mubarak has been really quite dismal in many ways. The American reaction has not been one which could give either courage to those who want to democratize their societies in the region, or for that matter, really gave confidence to those people who want to really maintain their traditional rule in that part of the world, but of course in support of the United States. I mean, if you really look at it, for example, just in the case of Egypt, if you really look at it, the military which is taken over is not happy with the United States, simply because the Obama administration has wobbled for too long, and finally it's only in the last few days that said we are going to really suspend some of our military aid to Egypt, and therefore the Egyptian military is not going to receive some of the major arms which they've already bought from the United States on the basis of the aid, $1.3 billion aid that the United States annually provides to Egypt. And but those who wanted democratic reforms, including the Muslim Brotherhood, if I may say so, they are totally disillusioned with the United States. I mean, again, over Syria, some of the United States allies, most importantly Saudi Arabia, is very much disillusioned with the lack of American action, and then they are very much disturbed by the fact that simply become another evidence for countries like Iran and Hezbollah, and of course some of the other actors as a weakness of the United States. So I think the United States now has sunk in more contradictions in its policy behavior towards the Middle East and towards the region as a whole than has been the case for really some time. I mean, at least in the case of Bush administration, the people in the Middle East knew where the United States really stood. I mean, in the case of Obama administration, they really don't know where the United States stands in relation to a number of issues which is becoming so disturbing, and in many ways they demand attention across the region.
Okay. Now, if you could raise your hand, we'll get a mic to you if you have a question or a comment. We've got one down the front here. Just wait for the mic to get to you, sir. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, this is directed at Tom or some of the other panel members who might like to answer. Tom, you argued that a reason against the United States intervening in Syria is the moral ambiguity of the sides. Now, it strikes me as something that is not morally ambiguous is the fact that a lot of innocent civilians are dying as a result of the Assad regime's huge superiority in air control and in helicopters and fighters strafing civilians and bombing civilians' homes. And you see horrible scenes of that especially on, if you look at SBS, Dateline, that sort of program, they're really heart-rendering scenes. Now, if you relate that to the Libyan intervention, which strikes me as a rather good intervention, what the United States did then, and the NATO allies, they implemented a no-fly zone. What do you think, what do the panel members think of the feasibility of a no-fly zone just to protect civilians from the horrible violence that they're suffering? Never mind who's right and who's wrong, just stop the killing and the refugee.
No-fly zone in Syria. What do you think, Tom?
Well, the policymakers in Washington on both sides are very wary about that very policy, just as they were in the Libyan case. I think what gave President Obama more impetus to push forward for a no-fly zone in Libya is that he had strong backing not only from the French government of Sarkozy, but also the British government of Prime Minister Cameron. As has already been pointed out, Adam pointed out, the British, on both sides of the House of Commons, opposed the Prime Minister on British intervention in Syria. Now, that was admittedly just over the question of the chemical weapons, but I don't think there is broad support in Britain, nor do I think there is broad support in America for even a no-fly zone. And it gets back to this point that I was making before. I think that in many respects, the Iraq syndrome could have a more damaging impact on the national psyche when it comes to American foreign policy than even the Vietnam syndrome. This is what I'm talking about. And President Obama knows where his bread is buttered. It gets back to this point. Americans are suffering from foreign policy fatigue, so I don't think there's even an appetite for a no-fly zone. Bear also in mind, the Syrians have a much better airstrike capability force than the Gaddafi regime did 2-3 years ago. So that's another point worth bearing in mind. On the moral ambiguity question, I don't doubt that the Assad regime is a brutal dictatorship and it has used force brutally against a lot of innocent civilians. But you'd be pretty naive to think that some of these opposition groups are modern-day Minutemen. There have been many reports of some of these groups not just wanting Sharia law, but taking young men and women who aren't prepared to bow to Allah and murder them in the streets and put it on video. Now, this is why, you read the New York Times front page story. This is a mainstream paper of record in the United States when they report these images and show photos of some of the disgusting things that some of the opponents have done. You then get a sense that it is complicated. And mark my words, if the Assad regime is overthrown, you can bet your bottom dollar that those Alawites, those small percentage of the people who have been governing Syria, will be murdered. There will be more than likely ethnic cleansing in Syria, and that's why these guys are clutching for dear life. They would be the new losers in the new Syria, just like the Sunnis are now the new losers in the post-Saddam Hussein Iraq.
Amin, your thoughts quickly on the prospects of a no-fly zone enforced by the US and its allies?
I agree with Tom. I think that's a very difficult proposition for the United States. I think to enforce a fly zone over Syria is going to be far more difficult than the NATO success in relation to Libya. The only way that the United States could enforce a fly zone over Syria, that is with enormous help from Turkey. But Turkey has got a serious problem at the moment, whereas the government is very much against the Assad regime, but the majority of the Turkish population really doesn't want any Turkish involvement in this conflict. If anything, they see the Turkish involvement as more destabilizing for Turkey itself, rather than actually contributing to the overall stability in the region. So the government of Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan has got a real problem in its hands. Here is the state going one way and the society is going another way on the Syrian issue. And without without the Turkish help, it's going to be very difficult for the United States, or for that matter, some of its allies in the region, to enforce a fly zone.
Adam.
Yeah, so when Martin Dempsey faced the Senate committee, the senators asked, what can the United States possibly do in relation to Syria? And what they were hoping for Dempsey to say was, well, we can't do boots to the ground, we can't do a no-fly zone, we can't do any of that, because they wanted a military way out, so that there was going to be limitations on what they could politically recommend. But Dempsey didn't say that. He said, $650 billion a year buys you a lot of military. We can do whatever you want us to do. And threw it back on the senators and said, well, what do you want us to do? This is a political problem. And the political problem with the no-fly zone is that there's possibility of mission creep. And a lot of the senators were concerned by that. So if you're enforcing a no-fly zone and one of the American pilots was to witness some humanitarian crisis, so there's some refugees under attack or something like that, you're going to have the Dutch problem. Do you just sit back and just watch this occur? Do you get further engaged? So there's going to be a slippery slope involved here, and this is what concerned many people with the no-fly zone.
Quick one, on the slippery slope issue, that's exactly right. The UN Security Council authorisation in Libya for the no-fly zone that you refer to was all about protecting helpless people who were being butchered by Gaddafi's henchmen. It did not authorise regime change in Tripoli. And I think that's where the slippery slope argument comes in. Once the no-fly zone is put in place, it's quite conceivable that it could lead to another thing, and then you may well have more US and Western intervention.
And I think this is precisely what has angered the Russians and the Chinese, because as far as they were concerned, they had only authorized NATO to protect civilians in Libya, not to go for regime change. And at the end, they did go for a regime change, and that's why I think the Russians are now very, very careful, and so are the Chinese, not to really give a carte blanche to the Americans and, for that matter, NATO over Syria.
Okay, we are running short on time, so if you wouldn't mind keeping the question short, thank you.
Amin Saikal talked about a poor US response recently in Egypt, and he said it was, I'm suggesting one reason for this might be moral ambiguity. The US sees Egypt as morally ambiguous in the same way that it sees Syria as morally ambiguous. And because you've got a military government opposed to a civilian who is trying to shut down opposing centres of power in his country and things like that. Now, is that true? And if it is true, is this a long-term problem for the United States? Once upon a time, the US could go to war and invade Cuba and bomb Vietnam, and it did a lot of ambiguous things, but there was a Cold War on, and it could do that then, and now maybe it can't. Is this going to be a long-term problem for the US?
I mean, there is some contradictions as a result of pragmatic considerations as well. The United States is very keen to see Egypt maintaining its peace treaty with Israel. And if that means that the United States somehow turn a blind eye over what the Egyptian military is doing in the country, I mean, it would do so because but the United States' priority is to keep peace between Egypt and Israel. I mean, that is very critical for the stability of the region as a whole.
Given a lot of factors, including the ascendancy of Kurdish power in parts of Syria and Iraq, is it possible that Syria as a political entity long-term is not viable? And if so, is that the beginning of the end of the Sykes-Picot division of the whole region?
I think that's a very good question, and I think if the regime falls in Syria, there is a serious risk of balkanization of Syria. I think Syria could break up into various fiefdoms controlled by various ethnic and sectarian groups in the country. And of course, Syria's neighbors will be scrambling for influence in pursuit of conflicting regional interests. It could easily turn into another Afghanistan prior to the American intervention. And of course, Afghanistan itself is still at the risk of somewhat balkanizing in the wake of the American and, for that matter, withdrawal of other foreign forces from Afghanistan by the end of 2014. So there is a risk of the Saikal, which really laid the foundations of the modern Middle East in a lot of ways, just simply changing, and geopolitical contours of the region are changing very substantially. I mean, some scholars have already predicted that is a possibility that the world will have to really take into account. And I think that's what precisely also frightens the hell out of the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and so on. They don't want that to really happen. Even the Turks, as the neighbors worldly, would like to really see the fall of the Assad regime. They don't want to see a balkanization of Syria, and for that matter, even the neighboring Arab countries. But one other point that I should really make, and I think that is very important, that the Syrian conflict, you've got, on the one hand, the opposition is not really winning, and on the other hand, there are forces in the region that they don't want the Assad regime to fall, not just from the Iranian side, not from the Russian side, not from the Chinese side, but or Hezbollah side, but rather from even the Israeli side. I mean, and yet the Israelis, they also will not be able to tolerate Tehran, Damascus, Hezbollah access. They're not going to tolerate that either. They don't want the Assad regime to fall, but they don't want that access to succeed either. And that is where the dilemma really lies for the Israelis, for the Americans, and for most of the other actors in the region.
Well, we're out of time, unfortunately, but I'll just ask each of our panellists for one quick final comment. When the history of this time is written and people look back on the US role in the Syrian conflict, such as it has been and might become, Adam Lockyer, first to you, what do you think this will say about the US place in the world and its role in the Middle East in particular?
It was be seen as Obama trying to be pragmatic and just dealing with the Arab Spring on a case-by-case basis rather than trying to approach it from a set ideological perspective. So I think that I agree with Tom that if we're going to try and pigeonhole Obama's foreign policy, it's probably more realist than anything else. But beyond it, but by far, it's just pragmatic, and he's dealing with a case-on-case basis. Now, we're going to look back, and historians are going to look at a whole bunch of errors that the Obama administration has made in relation to Syria. If he had have got more involved earlier on, perhaps he may have been able to stop the conflict, while the two sides were two sides and relatively weak. Maybe American political clout could have got them to the negotiating table and got some sort of resolution. But at that point, the Americans still thought that the opposition would probably win and win fairly quickly. So I think that there are going to be mistakes, but it's going to be seen as being a case-by-case basis rather than just one sweeping narrative.
What do you think, Tom? People like to talk about the Obama Doctrine, and some said that was characterised by what happened in Libya, build a coalition, force regime change. Is hand-wringing on the sidelines going to be the real Obama Doctrine?
No, I think, how's this one? Conceptually, this is what you learn at the US Studies Centre, all these terms that are thrown about, the end of the American century. And that is not an unhealthy development for the United States. I think that the approach that will increasingly be emphasised in Washington, and I think on both sides of politics, is not neo-isolationism. I think that term gets thrown around too often just because the United States has not intervened in the Civil War does not amount to a rebirth of isolationism, although there's no question that there is a yearning for some sense of withdrawal in many segments of America. But I think it's an approach to foreign policy that stresses an unsentimental focus on the national interest, pursued pragmatically with a concern and calculation about power, costs, ends and means, commitments, resources, good old-fashioned realpolitik. And I think that again, to the extent that those views prevail, it goes against the notion that America can be a global hegemon, the indispensable nation, a Pax Americana. I think that's what we're witnessing right now.
And finally, Amin, Saikal, no more the Pax Americana, or will Israel and oil always keep the US engaged to a certain extent?
I think Israel and oil will always keep the United States engaged in the region, despite this pivot to East Asia. And I think when the historians really look back to this period in the Middle East, they would see that the Middle East had not really succeeded in building the necessary foundations for political stability and regional security, and the outside powers had not been able to contribute much to building of those foundations. And of course, they will also look back and say, well, look, the big powers can easily lose small wars, as they have done in the case of Iraq and as they've done in the case of Afghanistan, I think, in many ways. So they will look back and say, here it was a very volatile, unpredictable region, and it's remained so probably for a long time, which really basically reminds me of the story of some of you may have heard of it, but those of you who haven't, the frog and the scorpion. The scorpion wanted to cross the Suez Canal and, of course, cannot swim, and look at the frog and say, could you give me a ride? And the frog said, why would I do that? If I do it, you're going to sting me and we're going to drown. He said, don't be stupid. Why would I do that? Because I will drown with you. And the scorpion thought, well, that sounds really logical. Okay, he said, I will give you a ride. And they were halfway through the Suez Canal, and the scorpion stung the frog. And the frog turned around and said, what did you do that for? And the scorpion said, this is the Middle East.
On that note, would you please thank our panellists, Amin Saikal, Tom Switzer and Adam Lockyer.